Welcome to the Consummate Athlete Podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. Peter, congratulations on defending your Masters National Champion of the World title this weekend.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was, I'm trying to say thank you and be appreciative of when people say things and not make excuses or anything and point out that it was Masters, but there you go. Sort of already did it. It was fun. It was a great trip out to Nova Scotia, visited some good friends who live out there, and also saw, people from across the country who were there racing or supporting or coaching or whatever they were doing. So yeah, really good week of visiting and seeing folks.
Yes, and smooth race despite having a bit of a debacle the day before, I'm going to say, with your bike. I'm very glad your bike stayed together for the race. That's a plus.
Right. Yeah, well, that happens. Yeah, so it was okay. Sometimes that happens in mountain biking. You have to
that's
repair stuff the night before.
Literally the thing that we always talk about on the podcast is like getting to the start line with your body and your bike in good condition, and you just barely accomplished that.
That's right. Yeah, it's always that first goal is that getting to the start line, not injured, motivated, not sick, on time, this sort of stuff. So it's tough. Yeah, and I saw over the course of the week, it's athletes, the motivation dips, which sometimes is a bit of a protective thing where, we've done all the work and then suddenly you're on race morning and you feel like you're not motivated. And that's, I think, pretty common and often is a bit of a protective thing. So you have to get yourself amped up. So that's the music and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the bike can break and then it's hard to get the right, parts, and you spend all day trying to get things working or whatever. So.
Mm-hmm. People are watching on YouTube. You have such like a comical Band-Aid on your finger right now. I can't stop looking as you're like moving your hand. It's frayed.
We'll remove that so there's not like disgusting Band-Aid memes or something.
The trouble with being married to you is there's always
blood somewhere. Yeah.
Blood somewhere. Yeah, I missed nationals this year. Not in terms of racing, and I never raced Canadian nationals, but did not get out to Nova Scotia with you simply because we are leaving at the end of this week for Leadville. So adding another, what would have been like 45 hours of extra driving, I think.
Well, yeah, thereabouts. But you did go down to New Jersey, so you got almost that amount of driving anyhow. But
as it turned out, so DW got to meet his cousin, I guess, my parents' new dog, just a mini doodle, and she is a lot. But DW got along with her great. We got out on the paddleboard with my sister. DW got out on the paddleboard.
A few people have asked me how you're feeling as you're coming into Leadville. Are you feeling smooth and uninjured?
Honestly, yeah.
Okay, knock on wood.
Knock on wood.
You're moving quickly. We've done a couple runs together, so we'll run more together in the next couple weeks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say all of the body feelings are good. I'm definitely starting to get into like the, oh crap, logistics. And like, it's not that I'm unprepared. I've been working on this stuff for a while, but definitely there's a lot of like, okay, I need to figure out exactly what goes where. And, we're getting packed up to go and all of that kind of stuff. So my brain's definitely feeling a little fried, I would say, like just trying to keep all of that stuff in my head and also like not start freaking out about the race. Like, I'm kind of, we talk about this on the podcast all the time. Like I'm kind of actually, to your point about motivation, really kind of waffling between like, yeah, this race is going to be amazing and like, I'm going to go for the win and it's going to be great and blah, 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 to like being like, well, even if it doesn't go well, you're still a good runner. This one race doesn't define, and I'm like, stop it,
right.
Stop it, because I'm already like preparing for it to not go well, which is tricky. And I mean, like let's maybe wrap on that for a second. Like, how do you talk to clients about that? Because on one hand, that is the reality, and it's probably good to have it in your head that races don't always go perfectly, and like, I don't want that to ruin my like past year of training. Like this should be really like a celebration of it, whether or not it goes well. Like it's, the process of getting there, blah, blah, blah. But how do you balance that with like also really wanting to do well and like give her?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it tends to go the way it goes and you get in there, but it is fighting, you don't want to derail your chances beforehand. So you do want to keep focused. So that is where, when we talk about process goals, it is the, in your warm up, what can you control, the music and what you're focused on, and make sure you're eating. Whereas you can see people starting to self-handicap by saying, oh, I'm not going to eat as much this morning, and, or I'm going to talk myself out of it, or be in the glums, or, not use my music, or whatever the thing is that doesn't put you in that right performance state. And then, beat yourself up in the first bit of the race too, where you might pace yourself into the race, especially in a long race like that, and do fine. But we sort of like count ourselves out before it even starts, or in the first bit of the race, depending on how it goes. Right. And, not that it's exactly the same, in the race at, Nationals, I had like not the worst start I've ever had, but very horrible, because they sort of just said go almost. I've never seen a national stage like so low key on the start. And I mean, it was a Masters race, so it's fine, but it was sort of like a minute to go, 30 seconds. And usually they say 15 seconds and they just blew the whistle. I was just like, what is going on? So I was like back, and I was able to get to the front, but it's sort of like frustrating, that wasn't necessarily my plan. And then, I could have just got mad at myself, but you carry on to the race and work from there. So yeah. So I don't know if there's any amazing advice, but I think it is being, when you know that stress and butterflies are normal before and good, right? And I've been reading a great book actually, and I can't recall what the name of it is. We'll talk about
The Upside of Stress.
Okay.
Is that the one?
You probably saw the title on my Kindle or something.
No, you told me it was my book that I put on your Kindle.
There you go. That's why you know the name. So the upside of stress, let's say that's what it's called. But the idea is that it's not always bad. And in fact, the way we think about stress can actually make it worse. And a lot of times people will say, chill out, relax. But especially in the context of racing, what your body is doing is it's like getting itself amped up and ready to do it. And so if you weren't doing that, you wouldn't actually be ready. You wouldn't be mobilizing the glucose and getting the body and the mindset focused in a certain way. So by accepting that this is how you should be feeling, it's one of those, same as the sleep the night before, by saying it's normal to not sleep the night before the race, you end up sleeping before the race.
Right.
This is the idea. So I think that's the idea, is just to channel that and know that, one of these things could happen. You could feel a little demotivated and low energy, and that's your body trying to like protect itself almost. And so you have to just sort of work with that and know yourself a little bit. Yeah, I'd say I'm also in the phase of like, I'm sure people listening have been here before, where now like the other night I woke up with like one of my nostrils like super clogged. Okay.
And like, I'm not saying my parents' house is a little dusty, but anyway, and like the panic.
Well, you see that with air conditioners now too. The air gets very dry, even dust aside. I see a lot of people who are saying that, the throat gets scratchy in the morning. Yeah.
Or like, like my gut feels like a little off. Oh God, I have like E. coli and like Giardia or something. Like just kind of really being a bit of a hypochondriac, I guess, about like
you don't
everything.
I mean, even on the plane yesterday, I was like, I'm going to get sick, and then I'm going to get Molly sick, and okay, well, I'll just book a flight to Denver so that I don't have to be in the. And I was like, well, you're not even sick yet, so. Just maybe wash your hands and you'll be okay.
I mean, also, like...
Stop picking your nose.
We are also still, like... Oh, yeah. We are, like, still 4 weeks out, a little under 4 weeks out, but, like, we are well under. Like, I have time to get sick, knock on wood.
Well, and this is, leaving that slack we talk about. And, not that everyone needs to go 4 weeks before their race, but, it is... not doing the day before, or in the case of airport travel, it is the try and go 3 hours instead of sagging it. They were telling me I could go an hour 45 because it was a smaller airport, and I was I just rather walk to my connections and not get stressed if there's a line. And then what is the effect of that? Like, I'm not getting really upset and sweating in the airport because I need to get through a line fast. It's just there's no major rush, right? And I think that's the same with racing, is to try and leave the slack, right? You pre-ride the day before if you're doing something like that, and with lots of time in case something breaks and you have to go to a bike shop.
Yeah. But yeah, that's, a big part of why we're going out early. I will say, definitely as far as slack goes, I was just at my parents' for, like I said, the last few days. And I will tell you that at the moment, I feel as though the cord has been stretched so much. There is no slack. There is no slack at all.
Sure.
Like all good stress, great seeing them, great spending time, but like, holy moly, am I glad that we have a few days here before we leave. And I'm really glad that we're going to be in Colorado with like a couple weeks where we don't see anyone pre-race.
Which is challenging. I'm not sure why you're telling everyone this, but the takeaway there may be, we try and get some of these things, whether it's work or family or whatever, away in those, few weeks. It might only be days. It depends on who you are and what you're getting ready for. But especially those last 2 weeks, trying to protect them. But we joke about the family vacation that comes in the 4 weeks before the event, and it's
Disneyland honestly, till the day before.
Probably those last 8 weeks you'd rather not have a lot of disruption, but life happens. Molly was just at her traveling and doing all this stuff, and then we're traveling again this week, and that's 4 to 5 weeks.
And we were at Olympic trials the week before, blah blah blah. Yeah.
So life happens. You can't ever be I don't think want it to be in like monk mode, like living in your monastery at the top of a mountain or something. But you try and make, especially as the race is approaching and those days and weeks before, that some of that stuff's been taken care of or can be pushed, as I call it, the back burner, and let it wait a little bit, right? And not trying to stuff everything into those weeks. DW says you can stuff into those weeks. But you want to, I see it sometimes with the peak and the tapers, where the volume's decreasing. You'll see the busy athlete, the type A athlete that a lot of us are. Well, I have so much time now to do work things and do this while I'm sitting here, and you to sit quietly and rest and just watch stupid TV shows, right? I think that's the time to line up those stupid movies you want to watch and laugh at and read that book, whatever your thing is, but try and think about things that aren't going to be as taxing. You don't have to be super productive in those last couple of weeks. Yeah. Which is the challenge we're coming into, I think.
For sure we are. But before we get into our listener question today, I will shout out our longtime sponsor, AG1, formerly known as Athletic Greens, because when you're talking about travel, you're talking about stress, you're talking about improving immunity and trying to avoid getting sick, talking about being at my family's house and a whole lot of all of my favorite foods, none of which are vegetables. Definitely very thankful to have the AG1 travel packs in the van.
And I don't know that I have a great recipe, but I've been I really like ginger in the morning. So I've been blending up some ginger and then putting it in with the AG1 for an extra bonus. I don't know if that's...
It smelled really good this morning.
It was okay. I'm getting close. I don't want to share my recipe yet because it's probably gross, but it's a really flexible product. I always talk about the travel packs, which you get 5, I believe, if you use our link. Travel really well. If you're going for a week trip like I just went for, you fit 5 really slimly into your backpack, or as I like to say, the back pocket of your skinny jeans.
Just dating yourself.
It's true. Everyone wears really baggy pants now. So what is that website that someone might visit?
drinkag1.com/MollyH. 5 free travel packs, year of immune supporting vitamin D drops, and of course, AG1 delivered right to your door. It's super convenient. You can pause at any time if you're going to be gone for a month or something. Cannot recommend it enough. Again, drinkag1.com/MollyH. All right, so our listener question. I hit a high heart rate. Does this mean I am out of shape? And this is such a good question because, heart rate is such a interesting, sneaky thing, right? As we get older, it gets harder and harder to hit the, very high heart rates. If you haven't done anything in a while, sometimes your heart rate starts really spiking at the start of, getting back out there into an activity. This morning when I was opening my mail, my heart rate was spiking like crazy.
All
because
the bills coming in.
All the bills coming in.
Oh yeah, for sure. I don't know. You don't do a ton of heart rate tracking anymore. You've done it in your life, but you don't do a ton right now.
No, it's my watch. I have the Garmin Forerunner 645, I want to say, and it tracks it on your wrist, and it's, I would say, reasonably accurate, but I don't actually pay attention to it or really look at it. I just know that it's there, and I always like having the data to go back to if and when it's ever needed, but no, I definitely don't pay attention to it in the moment.
And I think I've been pretty against the wrist optical for optical sensors. So the optical is like a light they're shining into your wrist or into your armband. I guess you could shine it into fingertips, or they do all sorts of different stuff with lights now, and tracking heart rate, pulse rate, they should, you might call it. But that's different than what you have on a chest strap, right? You lick your chest strap, maybe you don't lick it, maybe you just put some water on it, and then you put those two, I think there's like 2 leads, basically 2 pads on your heart rate strap, and they're taken in. So it's a different, right? It's akin to like sort of your ECG, where there's like an electrical signal versus a light that's trying to detect movement of your blood. Right. And so it's a different.
I'm going to push back on this a little bit, though, because you do use the HRV for Training app our good friend Marco has, and that one does use an optical sensor.
It does, and that's on your fingertips. The difference is you have to sit very quietly. So I'm not against the wrist-based thing, so this would be like a Whoop for recovery. Spot measurements. It's also difficult like overnight and things like this. And this isn't about any of those products. It's just asking a lot for a light when your wrist is jiggling when you're running. Especially a lot of us, have tinier wrists, bony wrists. And that's why the armbands tend to work a little better, is there's a little bit more skin and vessels and things like this for the light to be against. And then it can be a little snugger. Like just move your wrist right now and see like, I'm wearing a large watch and it's moving.
Well, your watch is ridiculous.
It's a bit of a calculator watch, but I don't know if a Whoop or something like that, an Apple Watch, they're pretty big. I would say they're like similar.
They are not.
Similar face. Maybe they're a little thinner.
They are not.
Anyhow, so that is, is this, that's the first question whenever you have like a data, like this is way higher, that's why we're talking about this, is you've had something really low or really high. People are alarmed when it's different than they expect, right? We've talked a lot about this expectations, reality equals happiness. Your expectations was your heart rate. I had 2 people say this to me during the nationals race. I couldn't get my heart rate up. And I was like, why were you looking at your heart rate? Why weren't you looking at where you were going or the people you're friggin' supposed to be racing?
Which we have talked about in the past couple episodes. We had one that was like talking about power during a race and not looking at it. And last week we talked about race results and how to kind of look at the files. And we prefaced it with like, absolutely do not look at your file during the race.
Right. Yeah, like the data. And I think we talked about some exceptions in that podcast, so please go back and listen to it. Share it with your friends if you might be so kind.
Rating, review, whatever.
But if you know that your reaction tends to be negative, or might be, or that there's nothing you're going to do with the information. If you see whatever the heart rate is, are you going to change your action? The answer for most people is absolutely not.
Right.
You're not going to slow down. You're not going to speed up because you're probably going as fast as you can and you want to, push. So this gets back to, is feeling good? Most people's feeling is good. We just get confused sometimes. So in the race, we wouldn't necessarily want to do that. But then after the race, you're saying, okay, this heart rate, it hit a certain value. And I think this is higher than I would expect. So first thing would be, again, back to the wrist stuff or even just your chest strap or your device. There can be errors in these devices. So a lot of times you can look at the file, and if it just looks like a random spike that goes from, your normal, say 160 beats per minute, and then it's, certainly if it gets up into the 200s, and you didn't even notice it, and then it goes right back down, or it just is like a tabletop, it's held up for some time. Those are errors, right? The body doesn't really work with like a tabletop. Your heart rate doesn't really stay. That's what HRV is there's variability in heart rate. So usually in a race, you would see, it might not move much, but it would be, 181, 179, 181, 179. But if you suddenly see 200 or 220 or 240, then it's going to be error data, right? Something happened. The battery, this stuff wears out. It can be vibrations. It can be wind. Again, with the wrist heart rate strap, it can just be that it's jiggling around violently. That's the beats of your running pace. Sometimes you'll see the heart rate starts aligning with your stride rate. So if you often run at 160, 170, 180, what is that called? Steps per minute? What is that? I forget.
I don't know. I still would have just called it RPMs, which I know is not accurate.
Yeah, well, whatever, right? Your step rate. I'm blanking on what that's called. But, you see that sometimes. My heart rate will go to 160 when I'm running, but I would expect it to be, 120, 130, maybe 140 if I'm doing an endurance run. And then I'll be, what is going on with my heart rate? I think I'm dying. I'm not working hard. I suck. But then you realize, oh no, your stride rate is actually 165 per minute. And it's just, so you'll see that with running fairly often. So all to say, we want to assess, is this an error? Often, if it's very regular for you, it is. There would be the exception. We should note that as we get older, often, Often in older, as we get into adults and certainly towards menopause, things like tachycardia, arrhythmias, these things do happen. Typically you feel it before you actually see the heart rate. Typically someone will feel like the world's ending. They're really out of breath. They need to stop. They're dizzy. And then you'll look down at your heart rate and you'll see something like, oh, wow, 218. And it's that you can feel that heart rate. So that would be something you should talk to your coach and, eventually your doctor, hopefully your coach will direct you that way, but talk to someone and get checked out. Often it's not a huge deal. This is, normal for endurance athletes, normal for people as they're getting older. It's not, the end of your cycling career. There may be a medical intervention for it eventually or modifications, with, how much coffee you're having, things like this. But that would be very different, right? So with those, so we have data errors. We have some people end up with arrhythmias and these things, and this happens. But often continue cycling and racing. It's not the end of the world. So those are two caveats then. So now let's assume that your heart rate is high. You go and you hit a new max in the race. It was hot. You were motivated. You went really hard. And you, instead of seeing 177, you saw 183 at nationals or at this big race. I don't view that as a horrible thing. I think that sometimes happens, that we surprise ourselves with how hard we can go, especially if we don't have a lot of experience or if we were really amped up. And again, all those factors start aligning, the temperature, you were just so amped up, the effort was high, right? All these things are, a 203 or 303 of those. I don't think that's anything wrong with you, and certainly doesn't mean you're not fit. Mm-hmm. It could just mean that you're, recovered and motivated. So that's fine.
Isn't it funny how so many of these things can mean unfit or super fit?
Yeah, it's very tricky. Now, on that other side, let's look at the the question sort of was like, does this mean I'm not fit? Well, you probably know one way or the other. You don't need, again, this is where heart rate probably isn't really informing if you're fit or not. Remembering that heart rate is not, we're looking at the trend. We're looking at it. I think about it. It's not a perfect thing, but the RPM gauge in the car, right? It's not telling you how fast you're going, but it's maybe telling how high the engine's revving. But you could be getting very different results. If you were in first gear, just flooring it, and you saw 10,000 RPM, it doesn't mean you're not going 100 miles an hour in your car. But if you were matted and you saw, so it could be very different depending on what you're doing and the situation. It's not perfect because it's RPM, but that's somehow I think about it. The other thing you could see, we're seeing this with the respiratory illnesses and time off and things like that. You certainly can get very high heart rate response and hit your max heart easily if you haven't been training a lot and it's hot and you're motivated.
Right.
Again, you would start seeing those sort of things happen. And in that case, it sort of means you're not as fit as you were, but often it'll come back quickly. It's not the end of the world. And in fact, a lot of us end up with depressed heart rates because we train consistently and maybe don't recover super well. So it actually, again, isn't the worst thing if your heart rate comes up, but that it certainly could mean that you have not been training consistently. But again, you don't need heart rate to tell you that, but that is normal. And often when athletes come back from, a few days or weeks off, we should expect this ahead of the game, but that is something to just, know that it's not the end of the world. It's just your blood volume has decreased. So your heart rate has to beat a little faster to get the same cardiac output out, right? So that you can power those muscles to do the same work. So that usually adapts back pretty quickly. But that would be the other thing to sort of see if your heart rate was up after you had time off, that would make complete sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there anything else there that we're missing as far as, the time off? It could be that you're really motivated, but again, I think it's just something that supports things more than, how did you do in the event, sort of usually answers the question about, are you fit or not? Mm-hmm. And I think our important point there that you wouldn't start with that, or just, you win, but then you look at your high heart rate and you say that you suck. I don't think that makes sense intuitively, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. And would you say the same sort of applies to power as well?
Well, that you want to assess if there's errors in the data.
Well, I guess it wouldn't be a high power, am I out of shape? It'd be I hit a low power.
Well, you know why I love power, versus heart rate. Heart rate, again, is just the system, how hard was the system? How did the system get the work done?
I forget if it was Andy Kogan. Someone once kind of pointed out to me that like you kind of have these three metrics for how you did. It's perceived exertion, heart rate, and power.
Sure.
And power is like perfectly objective data, and perceived exertion is pretty much perfectly subjective data.
Mm-hmm.
And then heart rate is sort of this very odd, like floating in the middle, like it's objective, but
Mm-hmm. You're right. Yeah. And it's generally, I really like heart rate. I would say I'm like a heart rate advocate. Not that I really like the other two as well. I think there's some great stuff with RPE coming, actually. Like the Garmin devices are going to start it. Some of them already started asking for session RPE at the end of the workout, which they keep asking like water, like how much water did I take? I'm like, could we just use this number for RPE? And you probably could actually do that. It would be a great workaround, actually.
oh, so it doesn't do like the. Does it do like the somewhat moderate,
yeah,
strong?
I think they're saying that it's better to give a bit of those words indicators and then 1 to 10. I don't know if it lets you choose, but it's coming. And then the great thing is that it'll be sending it into Training Peaks to sync. And Training Peaks, I think, is already announced this or will, where they're going to have this, like it'll sync to Training Peaks, which already asks you, but it's clunky, right? You always want like everything for the athlete to be like, okay, saving my workout, it pops up, and right now mine asks me anyhow, how many calories did you eat and how much water did you have, which in principle is okay.
So weird that they got that figured out before.
But it's still a number, yeah. And so I was gonna start, trying to use the hack of saying, yeah, instead of the amount of calories, you do that as your RPE, and I'm like, they'll figure it out eventually. So I think it's coming. So all that to say, I think RPE is great. It's not going anywhere just because it's low tech, because it is the best. I think it's like the best marker of how intense that was and tracked over time. It's very well supported in the research as well. Again, you wouldn't necessarily, if you could choose to use all of them, I think you would, right? Because then this gives us a triangulation of how everything's going. Heart rate gives you this trend line, though. If we just ignore even the numbers, right? That's what we spoke. Was that not last week? Maybe we spoke about how to assess your race.
Yeah.
And so we were saying, if the heart rate starts fading over the race, why would that happen? We talked about it could be temperature, but it could also be that muscularly you overpaced and you're fading. So you'll see that in 100 milers and long races all the time. Someone goes out at their best 20 minutes and then the heart rate fades. Probably the power, the pace is going with it, but it's an interesting thing to sort of have in there to see how that evolves. And then also, it gives the stress from heat and altitude. And I think it is worth considering. We've had different opinions on the podcast, which is great. But I think if you go out and your heart rate's maxed out and it's hot and it's altitude, the reality is that heart rate's going to have to come back down. Like your body, it only burns so hot.
Right.
And this is where the wattage proponents might say, no, a watt is a watt, but it's not, right? Like we just know that at altitude, you're going to have less power. So the heart rate gives you that strain, right? Do you have to interpret it? Do you have to be careful with it? For sure. But that's it.
Love it.
You did ask a question there, though. Did I get that?
You got it.
I don't know if I got that.
Yeah, it was just like, where does power fit, or like how would power fit into all this? So like, obviously, it wouldn't be like I hit a high power. Like that would mean you're very in shape.
Sometimes you'll see like I hit 2,000 watts, and you're like, I don't think you did. I think that's an error right there, right? So sometimes there's these cutoffs. Most adults aren't going to hit over 190 or 200 beats. There's irregularities. Like I do have a master who raced nationals at masters level, very skilled, and he's 50 and he can hit 192 or something.
I haven't hit 192 since,
whereas mine's 182 is the max, right? So it is very individual. And it's not that he's faster than me necessarily, or you can't predict that way, but that's how his body solves the problem of pumping a lot of blood. It pumps at 192. And maybe I did more volume over my life and my heart adapted to pump more at once. But then there's a trade-off that now my heart doesn't beat as fast, right? Or any of the genetic, stuff that comes with that.
Which I think is probably like the other caveat to anything heart rate, and I'm sure we've said it before, but like your heart rate is not the same as your friend's heart rate is not the same as their friend's heart rate. Like everyone has different, slightly
100%,
different ranges.
100%. It's always the weird. I sort of like it when athletes are like, "Oh, what's your heart rate?" and and they're talking about it, because that's good. I think you're learning about things. But I saw someone on Instagram, this coach was riding, and he said it was like a quiz or something to the people, and they were saying, my buddy beside me is going and his is 150 and mine's 140. Like, is he working harder than me or something? And we're riding up a hill together. And I was like, this is sort of dumb, but I guess it is a good question for a lot of people to ponder, because they may think, right, that would be the immediate thing, that the person at 150 is working harder.
Right.
But that's not the case necessarily, right? We could be working at the exact same level, or the person, like if my heart rate was 140, I'm actually working quite hard. But if I ride with some of the, 17-year-olds or 15-year-olds that I work with,
their heart rate's at like 250.
Yeah,
like...
well, that's it. Their max goes to 210 in a lot of cases, or thereabouts. And so, yeah, it's not, but they're also just very fit. So they're not, they're not working as hard as I am, perhaps, going up the hill. So yeah, there's so many variables there. So you wouldn't do that comparison. That's not one that you would necessarily look at, side to side like that. You can see sort of, I like the idea that, again, like sometimes it helps you decide these big buckets. Someone who's, the younger kids and heart rate really high, you tend to think, okay, maybe there is some room for like more volume. That's probably intuitive. If the kids just started training, there's probably room to train more. They're going to have lots of adaptations. Whereas your classic older person who's just stopped doing intervals and their heart rate, is quite low, there's probably room to keep intervals in there, right? It's the thing they don't do it anymore, right? So it's sort of intuitive. I don't know if there's anything like rocket science-y about that. But I always thought that was like a good rule of thumb. If your heart rate's low, you probably need to work on intervals. Not that it would even change it that much, but it sort of like gives you an idea.
Well, it does make sense that for any training plan you're doing, you really want to be playing within the range of your heart rates, right? Like you want it to be going to the top, but you also want to spend a lot of time at the low end. This is just periodization.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's your 80-20, right? And again, is heart rate useful in this case? Yeah. Like I would look at your heart rate. Training Peaks does this very well. They have buckets for your zones, if you will. You can set them up however you want. It could be just 80-20 style with 3 zones or with the 5 zones. But what you'll see is your long, slow distance, often older people who aren't racing anymore will be only zones 1, 2, or the endurance zones under aerobic threshold. Then you'll see, the motivated, but like typical, endurance athlete trains in the middle, your zones 3, 4, under threshold, but above aerobic threshold, right, in the middle, too often. And then a lot of times you won't see much in the top zone for anyone. And heart rate's hard to accumulate a lot of time above threshold, but that would be the idea, is like, are you going hard at all during the week and getting your heart rate above, say, 85% or above threshold or towards threshold, at all, right? And so that's where, again, heart rate can be something to look at, not necessarily every week, but look back over the year even and see, does your heart rate get up, very much at all? And then sometimes that can be a hint that there's fatigue or fueling issues, because if you don't fuel, it's hard to get your heart rate up. And if you ride way too much for your ability to recover your life, then it's going to be hard to get heart rate up. Yeah.
There you go.
And this might be where this initial question, you get scared because maybe you recovered and then you got motivated at a race and your heart rate actually came up and you think, oh, wow, I hit my max heart rate. And then that's a good hint that, you need to go back and start doing your interval days at that, say, 85 to 95% of max heart rate, where you are working quite vigorously and breathing hard once or twice a week, again, for adults.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think let's wrap up there. As always, keep the questions coming at Consummate Athlete on Instagram, consummateathlete.com. We have a whole lovely contact page now. Definitely check that out. And if you enjoy the episode, super, super grateful if you leave a rating or a review. It is incredibly helpful and we really appreciate it. All right. With that, happy training and we will see you next week. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.